Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus.
And I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller.
Since October 7, many international media outlets report as truth the Hamas narrative. With us today is British military expert Andrew Fox to discuss the key factors in this acceptance of the Hamas narrative. Andrew Fox served in the British Army, rising to the rank of major, and he is currently an associate fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, a think tank in the United Kingdom. He specializes in defense, the Middle East, and the psychology of disinformation. In 2024, Andrew visited Gaza twice, as well as visiting captured Hezbollah tunnels in Lebanon. Andrew, thank you so much for coming on our show. We're honored and thrilled.
No, thank you for inviting me. It's an absolute pleasure.
So I get to ask the first question. Which top media do you think play a strong role in this dissemination of the Hamas narrative? You can talk about both in America and in Europe. Okay, we'll go with that's the first question.
The first and most obvious media outlet for this is Al Jazeera. And it's not even close. It's not even close. They are by far and away the biggest spreaders of disinformation. The second source, I think, is the fact that many international media outlets rely on people on the ground in Gaza to give them information about what's going on, to send them video clips, etc., etc. And of course, nothing comes out of Gaza without Hamas's say-so and Hamas's permission. So straight away, the world's media are relying on information from people on the ground who are very likely intimately connected to Hamas. And a great example came about a month or two ago where the BBC showed a documentary about the life of children in Gaza, and it turned out the child in question was absolutely connected to Hamas royalty. And it was essentially a 1 hour propaganda piece by the BBC that they'd broadcast on behalf of Hamas. And they eventually had to withdraw that and apologize for it, and they were called out. But it was a great example of how these international news networks use stringers on the ground who are intimately connected to Hamas themselves.
So, what is the bias information that they're giving out? I mean, generally, and then I want to ask you about those numbers that I mentioned, the recent way down decrease. Who got
Mm.
them to do that? Anyway, go ahead.
So the sort of thing that's coming out, I mean, a good example would be the way airstrikes are reported. So you'll see every time there's an airstrike, if you get the right angle, you can see just how many cameras are pointing at the place where the airstrike is going to hit. Now, of course, that's because Israel evacuates civilians and gives warnings of airstrikes. But without that context, it looks as if some random civilian on the street happened to have their phone handy and caught this airstrike on camera, and then they can say that a load of civilians were killed as a result. And that's how the narrative gets out. Now, of course, if you've got five cameras pointing at it, that's not a coincidence. And that gives it away completely. And then, of course, there's the entire Hollywood industry of faked videos and luridly gory makeup and there's been a whole industry sprung up around that over the last 18 months. So, but the really important thing is here that we have to ask what the alternative could have been. And I think that's something that's been criticized a number of times, that Israel won't allow journalists into Gaza. Now, there's two sides here, and we can be quite nuanced about our analysis of this. The first case is that when you're putting journalists into a war zone, they're not running around doing whatever they want. That's not the case in Afghanistan. It wasn't the case in Iraq. Western journalists would be accompanied by soldiers. They would be at the back of, the fighting at the very closest. Occasionally, you get the super rare documentary maker who goes right into the battle, but that's incredibly unusual. Like Sebastian Junger is probably the most famous one of those. So the idea that somehow the Israelis have just stopped journalists running around and doing whatever they want is a nonsense. And if they had been allowed to run around and do whatever they want, one of two things would have happened. First of all, Hamas would have co-opted them and threatened them and made sure that the only thing that got out was what Hamas wanted people to see, or Hamas would have killed them. And if they had killed them, of course, that would then be blamed on an Israeli airstrike or an Israeli sniper. So it's really a lose-lose situation. You either cede the battlefield, concede it to Hamas, or you put journalists in an unrealistic level of harm's way. So there's no correct answer here. But unfortunately, the knock-on effect in the wider world is that Israel have been dominated by Hamas in the information battlefield.
And how come that is the case?
I think there are two reasons. First of all, Israel hasn't really tried. If I'm brutally honest, I don't think they have really tried to get their message out in any meaningful way. And I think that's because they haven't understood the battle they're fighting. They've framed this war as physical military action against Hamas and Hezbollah and all the other actors. I think they're ignoring the fact that it's 2025 and war looks slightly different, and the information battle can be almost as important as the physical battle on the ground. Because look at the effects of this failure to fight the information war. You've had, a White House before the last election that was fighting an election campaign and therefore had to take US voters' opinions in certain swing states into account. And therefore, this propaganda put pressure directly on the White House to get the Israelis to slow down operations. And we saw that 4 month pause between January and April 2024, where Israel held firm before going into Rafah, and it totally sort of stalled the momentum of their campaign. And that was entirely due to the information battle and its effects on the White House. So the Israelis haven't fought it and haven't really understood the environment they're fighting in when it comes to information warfare. And then the second factor is that Hamas are actually very good at this. The Palestinian cause has had, well, since 1964, and Arafat really have had a very, very effective propaganda campaign supporting them. And right from 7th of October, Hamas were good to go with this stuff. Genocide accusations were coming in on 8th, 9th of October against Israel. In the immediate aftermath, when the fighting is still happening in Israel, and they're still mopping up the final attackers from 7th of October. Even by then, they were already calling genocide in Gaza, not Israel. So that shows the level of preparation, I think, that went into this on Hamas's side. And they've been incredibly effective at getting their message out and leveraging it's an attack on people's emotions. That's how disinformation campaigns work. They show horrible images, some real, some fake, some from other wars. We've seen children from Syria, dead children from Syria used and presented as having been Gazan children. And it's very, very hard, I think, to be explaining away an airstrike in legal terms. You can say, yes, this was legal and proportionate, and we killed some civilians, but we also got the bad guy. We're really sorry about that, but that's war. You're making that argument if you're Israel, but it's very hard to make that when someone's showing a photo of a dead child. Makes you look cold and heartless, even if you are legally and in the correct. So it's a very tricky minefield to navigate.
Yeah. So, what are the factors in this willing acceptance of the biased Hamas narrative?
So I think we should start with anti-Semitism. I don't think everything is anti-Semitism. It's not. I think some people are just conned by very good propaganda, and I don't think the fact that Israel really comes into it. It's just we've never before seen a propaganda campaign of this scale in a war before. This is a first. And so going back to my earlier comments, we shouldn't be too hard on Israel for not quite understanding the situation because this is unprecedented in warfare. The scale of the stuff that's coming out is huge, and it gets everywhere so fast because they've got a really clever network of complicit media, of social media users with huge reach who are primed to share this stuff, and they're paid very handsomely by certain actors to make sure
Wait,
that
wait.
stuff gets
Could you
gets
repeat
spread.
that sentence once more? They're paid very handsomely.
Mm. There are a lot of people on the internet who've made an awful lot of money from Hamas's backers.
Mhm.
Okay,
Um,
keep going, but I wanted to emphasize that these people are paid in many
oh,
cases.
absolutely, absolutely. And we're also talking about um, so we've got anti-Semitism, we've got the paid propaganda and the scale of it, and then we've got, I think, there's a slightly, again, another nuanced point here. If we look at 100% of the world's population, in terms of who really cares, really cares, like enough to go out and protest or make a real noise, I'd say 5% are really pro-Palestinian, maybe slightly less than that are pro-Israel. And that leaves us kind of 85, 90% of people in the world who don't really care. And it's them, I think, that are almost they're the main battlefield because you're never going to change the mind of someone that's super pro-Palestinian. You're not going to change their mind. And they're not going to suddenly turn around and become Zionists. You know, you might get one in a million, but the vast majority are just they've got their ideas, that's that. And by the same token, if someone is heavily pro-Israel, they're probably not going to change their mind either. So you've got this 90% of the world's population who need to be swayed one way or the other by your propaganda or by your information warfare efforts. And really they're the target. And I think that's where um, the battlefield lies. And unfortunately, when it comes to the scale of information pushed out, Israel just hasn't been able to compete.
I don't understand why the Washington Post, for example, bel accepts the Hamas narrative almost word for word. I
Mm.
mean, what is it that makes, I don't know. I was trained to be an objective journalist 1,000 years ago.
Mm.
What is it that makes them in their news articles, even in the Wall Street Journal, my paper of daily choice, the editorials are very pro Israel, and the news articles skip a lot of the important information. It's fascinating.
Well, I'm working on some media stuff at the moment, and our working theory is that there's just too much missing information out there. And journalists in a 24/7 news cycle don't have time to go looking for that missing information. And so they'll take what's presented to them and run with it. Um, there's work to be done on providing that missing information and that missing context, and that's the piece we're actually working on. We're looking at a conference in the UK for global journalists sometime later this year to sort of try and provide some of that missing context. But that's what I think it is. I think it's the tempo of newsrooms, and it's the fact that journalists will generally print what they've got and what's given to them, and the investigative journalist who really goes deep is very, very rare. And then I think there's partially the fact we also have worldviews that people find it hard to get past. And those worldviews give us those inherent biases for or against one side or the other. Um, and the very dominant um, worldview, particularly in America, I think, is the oppressor versus the oppressed narrative. And if you can frame yourself as the oppressed, there's almost nothing you can do wrong in these people's eyes. And I think the Palestinian propaganda campaign has very successfully framed them as the underdogs. I think since 1967, I don't think Israel could really claim to be underdogs anymore. I think that was the decisive moment where that paradigm flipped. Um, but I call it the Star Warsification of warfare, where everyone assumes that the rebels are the good guys. Um, and I think that's a very easy and simple narrative, and people just fall into it very easily.
Um, so back to the bias. If you would correct the bias, what factual information would you correct?
I mean, there's so much to go here. I mean, I think the very first thing I would hammer home is that the legality of military action is not based on what happens. It's based on what was intended to happen.
Mm.
Okay, and that is the single biggest point of failure of analysis in this conflict, I think, where people see an airstrike, say, "Oh my goodness, that's awful. That must be genocide." It's a really flawed logical pathway because actually you can't look at a campaign in the round. You have to actually go and look at each action, each airstrike individually to decide if that was proportionate or legal or not. So you can't look at the wider campaign and say, oh, that's disproportionate, because that's not how the law of armed conflict works. Um, and look, I have done a degree in law. I have been a practitioner of the law of armed conflict. I've been a teacher of the law of armed conflict. And it's not straightforward or simple. And people don't seem to understand there is a huge amount of violence that you can get away with quite legally under the law of armed conflict. And actually, as we're seeing now, I think Israel's still behaving broadly legally, and they're going in far harder than they did over the last sort of phase of the campaign. So there is a tremendous amount of violence that can be done legally, and people just don't understand that. They see violence, think it's awful, and there's a really good reason for that. And I think this is a good point to finish this section on it, and that is that legal and moral are not the same things.
Mm.
Now, the reasons for a war can be completely moral. Self-defense, perfect example. But that doesn't take away from the fact that killing another human being is a fundamentally immoral act, be it the Jewish faith or the Christian faith or even the less extreme variants of Islam. You know, thou shalt not kill was one of the Ten Commandments for a very good reason. It's a very clear directive, and there's not much way around it. There's no real wiggle room there. You shall not kill. Boom, end of. And so, what the law of armed conflict is doing is trying to put sort of legal brackets around what is always a fundamentally immoral action. And I think people see that immorality of killing and are repulsed by it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing on their part, but they need to have the maturity, I think, to understand that sometimes wars have to happen. It's part of the human condition. And those laws that are around warfare are complex and are not easily understood by the layperson. So that's one critical piece of information that I think I would try and get across.
And
My
are there certain numbers that need to be corrected? Numbers that are out there in the international media?
Are you referring specifically to the Hamas
Mhm.
fatality numbers? Yeah, so I authored a paper on this back in December for the Henry Jackson Society. It's called Questionable Counting. And people can find that on henryjacksonsociety.org. And the reason I'm pushing it is because it was written for everyone who is in this fight. It's designed as a tool to be used rather than as a paper to be read. And what we did was we looked at the Hamas lists that they push out. So they put consolidated lists of names on Telegram every few months. Um, and what we found was huge numbers of errors, first of all, to the point where they can be considered unreliable. We found that the demographics, by proportion, it's overwhelmingly fighting age men that are dying. We found that in previous conflicts, Israel's estimates of numbers of fighters killed have been broadly accurate. We found that Hamas's totals have normally been about there or thereabouts, correct. But what they have consistently done in every conflict is hide combatant deaths. And that is a pattern we are once again seeing here, where they don't list any distinction between combatant and civilian, and they present everyone as killed by Israeli action. We know that's not true. We found names on that list who we know were killed by Hamas themselves. We know there are natural deaths on there, potentially thousands. We know there are men listed as women, women listed as men, adults listed as children. We know there are fake entries, that we know there are entries from previous wars from 2014. There are names on there from the 2014 war. And the final thing we identified was that the world's media has been overwhelmingly platforming Hamas over the IDF. 98% of articles that we studied cited Hamas's total. 3% used the IDF's figure of combatants killed.
Could you
Um,
could you mention the IDF numbers?
yes, so the IDF at the moment are working on about 20,000 combatants of the 50,000 that are presumed to have been killed in Gaza. And I think it's important to add that since December, Hamas have very recently released another list of names, and everything in that list confirms our paper. So it was kind of almost a relief. I mean, it's never a relief to know that civilians are dead, but sort of from a purely objective academic view, it was good that everything I've just listed was confirmed once again by the new release. And we've seen them take out, I think it's over 3,000 names. And do you know what? I'm going to claim for me and my team a little bit of credit for that, because we exposed all the flaws in that paperwork to the world. And now I think they're desperately scrabbling for credibility. So they're getting rid of all the names they can't justify.
That was the question I asked before this
Mm.
started. So I'll give you the credit for doing
A
that.
little bit of the credit. It's not just us, but I think it has to. I like to hope it was a factor.
And I
So,
would like to ask you a question about intention. It's a word that
Mm.
my husband, who was military intelligence officer for 2 years, 1,000 years ago, is always saying you have to look at intention, not
Mm.
capability. Because if you misjudge in capability, but what is the intention? And the Palestinians have said, we will kill the Jews. Okay, so there's their statement. How do you feel about that?
I mean, it shows you in naked terms who the enemy are. And I think it hammers home how appalling these protests in the West have been, and how absolutely devoid of any moral compass they've been. It's shocking. And yes, you can be rightly appalled at killing, but don't blame Israel. They didn't ask for 1,200 Israelis to be murdered and massacred in the most horrific ways imaginable. Um, and I would like to hope that anyone would do what Israel is doing in Gaza if they had been on the wrong end of a massacre like the 7th of October. I mean, I think it would be unthinkable just to assume that you could do a hostage exchange and leave it there, with that threat still right on your border and, hundreds of meters, if that, from your settlements and your kibbutzim and your military bases. So, um, yeah, they tell you who they are. Listen to them, I think is the key lesson there.
Yes, if they tell you they're going to kill you, rise
Believe
up
them.
early. What is that
Yeah.
famous saying? Rise up early and be ready. So, Evelyn, you have a next question?
Yes, as Andrew, as a former military officer, what does the IDF do right and what does the IDF do wrong to spare innocent Palestinian lives?
That's a really good question. In terms of sparing innocent lives, the first thing is they've got a cell to try and track civilian presence in Gaza. It's called the Civilian Harm Mitigation Cell. I've been and sat in there and seen how it operates, and it's really impressive how they track population densities in every little part of Gaza using a variety of open source intelligence and mobile phone data and other things like that. So even before they go into an area or hit an airstrike in an area, they know whether it's below, at the usual levels of civilian activity or whether it's lower, and that gives them a really good sense as to initially what collateral might be. They also follow a targeting process. This is exactly the same as the US or the British or the Dutch. There's no real difference. They look at the target, they work out the value of the target, they work out potential collateral damage, they work out if they have the rules of engagement and the law behind them before they strike. They select a munition and then they do a final check and then drop. And the Israelis have cancelled one in every two airstrikes in Gaza, because there's been too higher risk to civilians, which gives you
Can
an
you say
idea of
that
how.
again? Could you
Yeah,
just
one in every two airstrikes planned has been cancelled
because
due
of
to because of
the
civilian
damage
presence.
assessment?
Yeah, yeah. So, they're doing everything they can. And look, what they're getting wrong, I think, is first of all, I think potentially having a volunteer reserve army does lead to some discipline issues, and I don't think it's unfair criticism to say that. We've seen the selfies and the silly photos coming out of Gaza. Um, it's unhelpful. It's not necessarily criminal, but it's certainly unhelpful and a bit slack disciplined. And I think we can rightly ask if there's a lack of discipline in that regard, what other lack of discipline might there be? Discuss. Um, and the other thing I think I would potentially do differently is be better with messaging. Again, going back to my earlier point, I think as the missile is in the air, the information round needs to be following it straight on afterwards. They need to get the messaging out better and faster about who they've hit, why they've hit it. And I think, in fairness to them, they are getting much better as the war's gone on. They're pretty good at it now. They were terrible at the start of the war. It was taking days to get information out when it should have taken minutes or hours. The only sort of question to ask is whether it's too late and the narrative is now lost, and whether they can actually catch that narrative back up. I think that's easier said than done. But yeah, and then of course there's the final thing that sometimes bad things will happen and mistakes happen in war. Sometimes intelligence isn't correct. Look at the WCK kitchen strike. And we haven't had an investigation on the recent ambulance strikes either, but I have a very strong feeling it'll come out the same sort of conclusion, where deconfliction wasn't done properly, where potentially identification of combatants wasn't followed properly, and then mistakes happen and innocents die as a result. And I think, whilst obviously those things are terrible, I don't think we can be too hard on any army when this happens, because it certainly happened with our army in Afghanistan. It's certainly happened with the American army in Afghanistan. It's war. Nothing's ever perfect. Sometimes mistakes happen and people get hurt, and that's just one of the really horrible um, factors of going to war. That it's just a kind of fact of the business.
So your biggest criticism on the IDF is, if I understand you well, is the the level of information that they're not informing the world enough about why why they take their actions. Is that correct?
Yeah, but by the same token, you can't expect them to do a press release for every airstrike. There's not enough journalists. You'd have every single spare person in Israel, but it would have to be conscripted as a journalist if you did that. I'm talking for the big ticket items. And as I said, they have improved on that. So, they're doing, when it comes to civilian protection, they're doing as good a job as any army in the world, probably better, frankly. Um,
Do you know anything about the number of civilians um, killed compared to other wars? Yeah, for
Mm.
like
A
this is
yeah.
percentage of the
this
population.
is mainly or for a big part a war in the cities.
Hmm.
How is that in other wars? Were there similar amounts of civilians who fell, or
Probably
more or
slightly,
less?
it's probably slightly more in Gaza, but I'm wary. I'm really wary of these comparisons because no two wars are the same.
Mhm.
Um, and I think there's been a lot of very lazy thinking in the West when they come to critique what's happening in Gaza by saying, oh, for example, oh, in Northern Ireland, we didn't do that. Why would you do that in Gaza? And it's like, well, the Northern Irish didn't go on a massacre spree, in England and kill 1,500 people on a day. It's totally different. Gaza is also a unique environment to fight in. No army has ever had to fight in an environment like this before. And you talk about it being a city, but it's not just a city. It's a city on the surface and it's a city underground.
Yes.
Hundreds and hundreds of miles of tunnels. And even today, reports are suggesting, even after 18 months, they've only been able to find a quarter of them. That's how buried and deep and impressive those tunnels are. You could walk from the northern part of Gaza to the Egyptian border underground before this war. That's how extensive those
Yeah.
tunnels were. And we cannot underestimate how much more challenging that makes the environment to fight in.
Do you have
It's
yeah, do you
so
have information whether Israel was aware of the building of those tunnels, of the existence of that tunnel network before October
Yeah, I
7th?
mean, I think in the previous two rounds of conflicts, they were tracking the tunnel's presence, but I don't think they appreciated the scale or certainly I don't think they anticipated having to be able to fight through every inch of them. Um, and I would also say the other way, and I think this is a really important point, the other way this war is different to every other war in recent years is that Hamas are deliberately trying to get civilians killed. There's that's such a critical point. Their entire strategy in this war has been to maximize civilian deaths
Of
and
their
try
own
and get
or of the
of,
Israelis?
of their own. They want their own people killed because they are martyrs. They are they're martyrs to the cause, the Palestinian cause. And international pressure from civilian deaths is what they relied upon to stop Israel from fighting. That was the whole purpose of this human shield strategy.
I
And so
will,
we can't, sorry,
Eric, I
sorry,
wanted to
finish.
say the
Go for it.
leaders aren't volunteering to kill themselves. It's the people that, yes, go ahead. I'm
Yeah.
sorry I interrupted you, but it's
Yeah, because if you actually cared about the people of Gaza and if you
right,
were Hamas's leadership, you'd let them into the tunnels and you'd
right,
be on the surface fighting. But it's
exactly.
not, it's the other way around. They're hiding amongst the civilian population. They're weaponizing hospitals, their ambulances, mosques, universities, schools. They're deliberately using all of this protected civilian infrastructure. It's a war crime to do that. Let's be absolutely clear. And they're weaponizing that to try and get Israel to stop fighting and to get Israel dragged through the international courts because they've hit what used to be a school is now a military command center, but they can say it was a school. Um, so this war is different to every other one that's come before in the past, and Israel is fighting an impossible battle to try and save civilians. And when you're fighting an enemy that wants its people to die, it's inevitable they're going to succeed in that more often than you'd like. And it's just a horrific fact, and yet another example of what utter monsters Hamas are.
So there is a law that has rules for how to fight a war as military, right? There,
Mm.
there is a law for that. Is there also a law for groups like Hamas, who are not an official military, I think you could call them a terrorist organization.
Yeah.
Is there any law that is binding to them?
I think if you're a combatant, you have to follow certain
Hmm.
rules and procedures. You'd have to go and ask one of the military lawyers the exact specifications of that one. Um, but the point is, the Geneva Conventions are exceptionally clear. Now, Hamas, of course, haven't signed the Geneva Conventions, but um, it's safe to say that these we can just go, we can take it away from legal, and we can just say, look, this is morally abhorrent. It doesn't even have to be a legal designation. Going back to my previous point, if we're talking about morality and things being immoral, I don't think there's anything more immoral than forcing civilians to be your human sacrifice. It's truly horrifying.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it just boggles my mind that even if they had attacked, to be so brutal with the attack, to rape women and bind them and shoot their children. I mean, it boggles my mind. But also, perhaps you'll answer this question. Why did the Israeli military, you think, not pay so much attention to the female spotters who kept saying, without guns, who kept saying those
Mm.
young, there's something happening here. And they would go home on leave and they would say to their parents, there's something going on. Why did Israel not listen?
That's a really interesting one. I think it's because they fell into the trap of thinking they knew their enemy. Hamas worked very, very hard to persuade Israel that they weren't a threat, that PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, one of the other groups in Gaza, that they were the real threat. Hamas were happy to keep taking money from Qatar, and everything would be well if that money kept flowing. They did a really good job on Israel in tricking them into thinking that. Um, they were assuming that the northern border was the one where the attack would come from. They thought Hezbollah were the guys who were going to do 7th of October, and everything was focused on preventing that. Um, and I think there's an element that it was similar to 9/11 in the sense that they had all the information they needed. Like we know that US intelligence agencies separately had all the information they needed to know that an attack was coming, but nobody stitched it together. And I think that's a very a very common thing in intelligence communities. Actually, it's a real cognitive trap that you have to be careful about falling into. Is those two things: is assuming that you know the situation and then failing to take into account dissonant information that disagrees with what you believe. Um, and there's probably a degree of sexism in there as well. I think that there is a certain caste system in the IDF where certain units and roles are given a lot more credibility than perhaps some of the lower down ones, and perhaps it's very easy to ignore young girls who are unarmed who are just watching the Gaza border. But yeah, the information was all there, and it's just a staggering intelligence failure on Israel's part, and there's no way around that. We can't sugarcoat it. It is what it is.
So, what lessons can be learned from this biased misrepresentation that we can do something about?
What can we do about it? Well, I think having the facts to hand is really important. So there's a duty on someone who wants to fight this battle to actually educate yourself and get the facts that you need in hand, and hopefully things like my paper um, will be useful for that. Um,
We'll carry the URL in the description because it's so important.
yeah, fantastic. But there's lots of other good work out there as well. There's some more stuff coming out from the Henry Jackson Society in the near future, so you can sign up to our mailing list. There's about 4 or 5 different papers coming out on the Gaza war now, including my next paper, which is exactly about that human shield strategy and how Hamas does it. So that'll be more information to hand. There's some great people on social media you can follow, like Salo Eisenberg, Eitan Fischberger. There's some great people out there that give you the facts that you need to take this fight forward and take people on. But there's also, I think, an element of a willingness just to put your head above the parapet and say that you don't have to get into the details of the fight. You don't have to have rebuttals at your fingertips. It's enough just to say, particularly in the context of anti-Semitism more globally, just to say I stand with Jewish people and I stand against anti-Semitism. And I think in many cases that's just enough. If enough people who are non-Jewish will do that, then I think that's a very powerful message. Because I speak to my Jewish friends in the UK, and I know they certainly feel very isolated and very unsupported. I can't speak for any other countries, but I'd imagine that's replicated elsewhere. And so just simple gestures of support go a very long way. So yeah, it's about taking the fight on as best as you can, and then it's about having the courage just to put your head up and say that you support our Jewish people.
I think, Evelyn, unless you have another question, that's a really good place to end. And Andrew, I thank you so much for taking time to come on the show. I know you're wanted everywhere. I mean, in a positive way.
And in a negative way sometimes too.
But I just think it was so important that we heard what you had to say and that our listeners really had a boots on the ground view of what's going on. I thank our listeners for listening. For those of you who want to know more about Evelyn and myself and our other work, go to Never Again Is Now podcast at Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, and as we say, and as Andrew has just said, we end every episode with saying, speak up against anti-Semitism